Okay, hi everyone. So today we're going to be prepping a case. It's a motion that I did at the VIT round robin last weekend. This house believes that the media should not take institutional stances on the innocence or guilt of people who have been charged with a crime but not yet convicted or acquitted. So it's a variation of the motion of like the media should not report on the background of criminals, or like the media should not report on suicide and stuff. So it's the debate often revolves around the type of information that would be released towards the public, especially when you perform investigations and look into those things. And like generally the debate for assessing the impacts of those things. Right. So I think it's a relatively straightforward motion. Like I said, it's a variation of a media motion. So I think that most arguments and discussions involving media propagation of information should apply in this debate as well. And the question is just how you mechanize the impacts in a way that's winning for your side of the house. Okay, so as usual, when you first get a motion, first thing you need to do is to break down the words in the motion and then talk about, like, just figure out the context and the problem in the debate. So the media should not take an institutional stance on innocence of guilt of people. Let's first talk about the media, right? I think we're talking about social media, news media, TV, etc. These are basically things that have a, generally speaking, wide coverage. So wide coverage and spread of information can reach a lot of people. One thing that always comes up when it comes to media debate is that, especially when we talk about the reporting of news, media companies are often split along a political spectrum. So you have media that reports predominantly around right-wing news, so news companies like Fox News, and you have centrist companies, centrist media companies like the BBC and CNN. These are companies that make a very specific effort to try to represent both sides of the political spectrum. And then obviously you also have more liberal shows on the left. A lot of the news coverage shows like Jimmy Fallon, Trevor Noah with the Daily Show and stuff, John Oliver. These are all media that predominantly lean towards the left-wing end of things, the more liberal side of things. When you talk about print media, The Economist is a very good example of a very liberal left-wing like print magazine. And they also, so I think The Economist, unlike most other media, is not afraid to take a stance on things, which is one of the things that I like, because they actually, provide analysis and arguments to explain why they believe things ought to be a certain way, as opposed to most other media companies that just try to sit in the middle, sit in the center, and not really take a stance on things. So let's just add this here. Political spectrum. Left wing, center, right wing. Right, so here we have like Noah's, Daily Show, John Oliver's, Tonight Show, The Economist. These are all very strong in the left. In the center, we have most news companies, CNN, BBC, clear policies surrounding neutrality. Actually, I'll just add here to Fox News also, right on the left. Most news companies attempt to maintain neutrality. The reason for this is just because they want to capture as many people as possible, because they earn money or they profit by having more audiences watch the show. So they don't want to exclude certain people by having a very strong stance on certain issues that some people may not necessarily agree with, which is why they try to avoid taking very clear stances on certain things in the news. Right, so right-wing news companies, we have Fox News, we have, what is the Ben Shapiro show? What is that? the Joe Rogan show, etc. Like a whole bunch of them. Okay, so I think this is basically what it is. What is the role of the media? Propagate information to the public. At this we can say it's a lot to do with political accountability, especially in a democracy. Voters need access to information to be able to make informed decisions, right? So voting, everyday choices, consumer choices, etc. Which school to go to, etc. What are politicians doing with your tax money? What is the police doing? Like, these are all things that people ought to know. Okay, so I think that's basically it for the media. We can always come back to add things later. This comes back to question. Okay, so the other part of this debate, like, and I know the word is very convoluted, but it's basically a singular concept, right? Okay, let's just talk about institutional stances for a bit. Institutional stances, I think it's just quite straightforward, is that the media company in question takes a stance on something, i.e., they believe X to be true. So in this case, they believe Trump to be guilty of treason for XXX reasons. And evidence presented, right? So involves a discussion of the facts at hand and also the consideration of counter evidence, right? So that's basically what a stance is. Just the alternative, no stance, maintain neutrality. We just report for the fun of reporting. Okay, the last thing here is that innocence or guilt of people who have been charged with a crime but not yet convicted or acquitted. So basically what this means is accused criminal, right? So I think the context of the debate is most often happens in a situation of a very high profile crime. Individual or group of people arrested and are undergoing investigation by the relevant authorities. You can say maybe court trial still in progress. No clear ruling yet. Okay, so I think that's like the most accessible context where this debate occurs. The next part here is that it's just these people, right? They've been charged with a crime, but they have not yet been convicted or acquitted. It just means that the process of justice has not completed yet. Examples of this, or like relevant context, e.g. is like the mass shootings in the US, e.g. Sandy Hook shooting. You also have terror attacks. Like it's just large-scale bombings, and then some people have been arrested, they've been suspected to have certain involvements and stuff. Or like, I think the debate also revolves a bit around school shootings, or like maybe serial murderers or like serial rapists like Ted Bundy and stuff, while they're undergoing court trials. The other thing, oh yeah, politicians accused of corruption, undergoing investigation. So, e.g., the Mueller investigation of Trump, court trial of Najib Razak in Malaysia, etc. So this is basically what it is. There's no clear evidence one way or another, but the debate is about whether the media company should take an institutional stance on these people. About whether news companies, or media companies rather, should take a public institutional stance on such things. All right. So, any questions about the setup so far? I hope it's clear.
No, for me.
All right, amazing. Then we'll move into prepping the Gulf case. The first thing that you need to identify when you are prepping a case for either side of the house is the central question in this debate or the thesis statement, right? So I think it's like, how should we put it up here? This is like the thesis statement, okay, or problem statement, whatever you want to call it. I will bold it because the word is nice. Yeah, so the debate is about whether the media company should take a public institutional stance on this. The burden of God is basically to show that media companies should not take a public stance. Yeah, should not take, correct. Media should not take a public stance. Doing so brings more harm than good. The harm outweighs the benefit, basically. And then the burden is just the person opposition. You just need to show that this move is one that brings more benefits than harm. Okay. As in most debates, the first thing that you need to do on the Gulf bench is to characterize and flesh out what's the counterfactual that you support. So while this motion isn't like a prefers motion that requires quite a lot of work building, I do think that some things need to be specified with regards to specifically what are you defending on government. So I think that the counterfactual you probably want to spot here is that media companies like those that we discussed should not take institutional stances on such issues and report on the facts of the issues of the cases. Should try to report as thoroughly as possible, but leave decision making, or like I think value judgment is the word. Leave the value judgment ambiguous, up to the audience to decide for themselves, at least until the relevant authorities have made or have come to a decision. Cool. All right. So, where's my screen? Okay. Yep. All right. So I guess the first question that we need to ask in this round is, why is the media taking a public stance on such things, something that's harmful? And I think that here's where, especially on the government side of this house, you want to really exploit and really explain the incentive structures of media companies to explain why the ways in which they're likely to report on like such individuals, especially in the lack of clear evidence and stuff, is likely to be structurally harmful. So in terms of the harm, the most obvious harm, or at least the most intuitive harm that I can think of, is in terms of the empowerment of stereotypes, because of the reasons why, or because of the incentive that media companies have to try to reach out to capture as many people as possible, capture as many things. So the outcomes of this is firstly a lot of confirmation bias. Second is like locking people into echo chambers and stuff, and just forming very divisive political opinions surrounding certain things. Also, when it comes to when you talk about mass shootings and like a lot of discussions about mental health or like terrorist attacks and discussions surrounding minorities, these are situations where stereotypes are often created and built, especially with regards to members of the majority. And these are reasons as to why you would not support the media taking a stance on those things, because of the type of information that God. Yeah, because of the type of information that they would report as a result. Okay, so first argument. Media reporting. Media companies taking a stance on the guilt of an accused criminal creates very harmful stereotypes, creates prejudicial and harmful stereotypes surrounding the accused. Right. So the first thing that you need to discuss here is the incentive structures of the media. And again, incentive analysis is very important to prove the likelihood of certain outcomes materializing, because like you can claim that media companies would do this, and the opposition would claim that no, media companies would do that. And like you can assert and counter assert until the cows come home. But neither side really wins unless you are able to demonstrate the structural likelihood of the outcomes you are discussing materializing in the debate. And the way to do that is to analyze the incentive structures, which just shows why on balance of probability, people are likely to do something as opposed to not doing something, or as opposed to doing something else. That's why incentive analysis is very important. Okay, maximize profit. How do they get profits? By gathering viewers, right? Maximizing number of views, scope of their audience, etc. Right? So the way that they do this, or rather the incentive, especially in a privatized media market, when there are many different news companies, each of them are vying for the attention span, or like the very limited attention span of the audience. So what each of them have to do is to try to capture as many of them as possible and try to report things in a way that is quite like damaging lah. You can make that argument here. So the first thing to note then is in terms of characterizing how exactly media companies are going to discuss and really deconstruct the identity of the individual in question, and then show how this leads to a set of problems. So it means that they are likely to try to use attention-grabbing headlines, sensationalizing the story, pushing narrative to the extreme, so they can outcompete. Other news companies, right? So this basically dramatization or sensationalization of news stories that we generally argue in this debate. What this looks like, news companies looking into the background of the accused, e.g. and the Hook school shooting. Looking into the mental health, background of the shooter, speculating about why they could have done something like this, right? E.g. talking about violent video games, lack of social interaction, etc. These are all the things they can talk about. Okay. The other example you can look at is terrorist attacks, e.g. people responsible for it, their religious background, their identity, or I would say immigration status, etc. fueling Islamophobia, and generalizations surrounding an entire group of people, right? So it might be race, might be religion, whatever it is. Okay. It can also be things like what other mass crimes very popular, people look at it and stuff. Let's say corruption scandal. Okay, usually the Mueller report. Trump, okay, speculating about things that Trump might not have done, e.g. making phone calls with the foreign minister of what is it? I think Ukraine, if I'm not wrong. Russia/Ukraine, I can't remember. Right. So these are all things and evidence that the media company are going to get their hands on, and they are going to do that. Okay, the next part here is where you need to characterize and explain the process through which media companies speculate and come to an institutional stance about something, about a certain individual, right? So taking an institutional stance on an issue requires media companies, especially when we talk about like reputable media companies, we're not going to talk about like your random anonymous account on Twitter and stuff, like things that's not really part of the debate. So basically it requires media companies, especially larger, more reputable ones, to seek out evidence surrounding the accused, create a profile and background story, in order to come to a value judgment that this person is guilty/innocent. Okay. So, right. Okay. So obviously, evidence will likely be fact-based, especially news organizations that care about their reputation, don't want to be accused of reporting fake news. Okay, so here's where we start weighing the outcomes and impacts. I think there are a lot of outcomes to this that are relatively intuitive and that can be pushed in to be argued why it's like harmful in terms of impacting the harms. The first thing I think is like the most obvious one is in terms of the privacy of the individual. Individual being violated, especially the privacy of accused family and people around them. Okay, so you have journalists being nosy and asking questions. And then you can just basically argue that these people already going through a traumatic period of time. Additional public scrutiny does not help them. Right? And then this is one thing. Right? So harassment by various different journalists, wanting different statements, blaming the family or the accused in different ways. And this is quite like terrible for the person because it's a massive invasion of their privacy, but also especially in cases where the charges are eventually dropped and the accused was proven to actually not be guilty of the crime in question, then a lot of the harm become reputational because this existed and already out there in public media. It's very hard to take those things back. The second outcome here is where you can look at the types of media companies in terms of identifying the media companies on the political spectrum and how they're likely to interpret certain facts in their favor. Okay. So different media companies of the political spectrum likely to focus on different parts of evidence or interpret the same facts / same events in radically different ways. Okay, so very good example for this is in the George Floyd case. Murder by Derek Chauvin. Left-wing media focus on police brutality, lack of accountability. Right-wing media focus on George Floyd's criminal history to suggest that the violence of the police was justified, right? Or left-wing media to suggest that police were at fault. And like most things in politics, different political parties just take stances that are diametrically opposed to each other so that they can capture different groups of voters and try to maintain power. So basically, the impact of this is that because media companies exist along a spectrum, and because especially in liberal democracies, people often are locked into their own echo chambers of information, right? Tendency to be locked into their own echo chambers of information, seek out info that confirms existing biases. What this basically creates is that people form radically different opinions about the exact same event because of the way media companies present the narrative to people. And again, it all comes back to the fact that people want to know about these things and why those things are incredibly damaging towards them, like generates fear and all those things. Right? Media company incentive to use fear get more viewers, likely to push the narrative to the extreme. And again, it's not just that George Floyd had a criminal history, it's that George Floyd was an active Black person trying to antagonize the police. The police were just doing their jobs and stuff like that. So these are ways that the narratives are pushed to the extreme. The impact of this is greater degree of political polarization because of the way media companies spin the narrative. People can only form opinions based on info they are given access to, thus creating the polarized opinion in society today. And the reality is that, especially because the court case or the investigation is still proceeding, there's still a lot of procedure that needs to be followed. It could rightly be possible that there isn't sufficient information for people to make a stance and decide one way or another. And that's where media companies come in to basically fill in the gaps, use all the journalistic investigations and stuff, and then try to form an opinion in one direction or another. Okay, so that's the echo chamber argument. The last impact of this, I think that you can talk about in terms of an outcome. Yep, so the last thing that you can discuss here effectively is propagation of stereotypes, especially those surrounding minorities. Okay, so I think there's quite easy examples of this. So again, if you look at George Floyd, criminal history, points to stereotypical, I would say stereotypes in general surrounding the Black community. Generally being criminals and pest to society, right? E.g., radical Islamic fundamentalists point to stereotype of Muslims generally being involved with radicalism, propagate fear, Islamophobia, general discrimination against them. Again, why is this so harmful? Why is it damaging? Stereotypes and generalizations, especially negative ones, very harmful towards the minorities in question, changes the way people treat you, forming of prejudicial, I would say forming of prejudicial, I would say opinions about individuals based on visible attributes. Okay, direct discrimination starts to provision of opportunities, microaggressions, social ostracization, etc. So this is just, all of these things just necessarily make the lives of minorities terrible and worse off, right? E.g., post 9/11, racial profiling used to search Muslims and other Arab-looking people, apparently. Oh, sorry, that's the fourth harm here, is that it creates massive political capital for right-wing politicians to ostracize and blame minorities for social problems, e.g. Trump blaming immigrants for the downfall of America, things like that, right? So there's a lot of support for things like the Muslim ban. There's a lot of support when Boris Johnson and people like Viktor Orban in Hungary, they weaponize a lot of these narratives against minorities and use it to blame immigrants and minorities and Muslims in general for the problems the society is facing. Often leads to the direct structural state failure to protect them. In many instances, direct antagonization of these individuals by the state. Right. So specifically with regards to this motion, because there is a debate about justice, essentially, there is a fourth impact that you can run. Okay, and that's basically the O.J. Simpson argument. where media narrative potentially affecting or impacting the course of justice. Very interesting argument if you know how to make it. So basically, the argument goes that the course news media reporting and covering high-profile court cases, criminal investigation, have the ability to sway the outcome of the case, right? So basically, the analysis here is judges are human, also exist in society, also vulnerable to narrative propagated by the media, friends and family, when such things are part of the public discussion or public discourse, basically. In the US, you have jury. Jury members are sometimes exposed to before being sequestered. Being sequestered just basically means being separated from what happens in society. It's supposed to make you unbiased and stuff, but like you are still exposed to information before you are sequestered to begin with, so that's potentially quite damaging. Also, sequestering process not perfect. Sometimes they're exposed to media. Okay, these are the people responsible for deciding on the outcome or the determination of guilt as an individual and stuff. And so all of these subtle subconscious biases are, as much as judges try to be impartial and as much as judges try to be fair, the fact that this information exists, the fact that this narrative exists, people are talking about it, has the potential of swaying the judge in one way or another. Right? So potential for biasing. What's the word? Actually, judicial, I don't know the word that's influencing the bias. People responsible for deliberation of justice and might not consider the evidence presented in the same way as they otherwise would in the counterfactual. The last thing to note here in terms of like the mechanism is that judges and the judiciary, so unless you are appointed to the Supreme Court as a judge, there is a lot of other potential for you to gain greater political office. So what this basically means is that there is pernicious political incentive for you to decide the outcome of a case in the direction that the public sentiment is, as opposed to the direction of, you know, what it should be. Okay, so judges, so I think this applies to judges specifically, but obviously you can make the case for juries as well. Political aspirations, so are unlikely to rule in against public opinion, or may not apply such a strict sentence if they are running for public office in the future. The outcomes of this is basically that this perverts the course of justice No, it's not given a fair trial. Most strongest example of this is the O.J. Simpson case. Media scrutiny on the court case put severe pressure on the judge of the case, eventually leading to the dismissal of key evidence of the prosecutor's case due to police mishandling of the evidence. Right? OJ essentially walked free from a murder charge because public pressure on the judiciary to get rid of evidence, to like kick out the evidence basically. So Netflix has this documentary, The People versus O.J. Simpson. It's quite interesting also. If you look at the way that media companies, like the newspaper especially, how they characterized the court case and how they presented it to the public. So it's basically, it was a case of like racism and how the criminal justice system is just like structurally discriminatory against Black people. They hired a Black lawyer to represent O.J. They got all the evidence. They focus a lot, the defense strategy focused a lot on taking out the key evidence of the prosecutor's case, and they're relying very much on DNA evidence to get the prosecution for O.J. Simpson. So once the defense was able to prove that the DNA evidence was mishandled, like it was not 100% within protocol, that was enough for the judge to throw out this evidence. And because the prosecution's case was staked very strongly on this DNA evidence, the rest of the evidence was insufficient to reach the burden of beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's why the case eventually got thrown out and the charges were dropped. So this is an example of a way that media narratives could potentially influence prosecutors. It's a very controversial example. Like some people say that's a good thing, some people say it's not. But regardless, it is an example you can use to prove this argument. You can argue that if that evidence was not taken into consideration, or rather, if the evidence was taken into consideration, then OJ basically, I think the public consensus is that he probably did kill his girlfriend. But because of insufficient evidence, he basically walks free. So in a world where the judge was not under such great public pressure to dismiss the evidence, it was quite likely that he would be successfully charged here. Okay, and obviously all of these things just need to be weighed against the counterfactual in opposition in terms of the value that this information could provide towards the greater public. All right, does anyone have any questions about the Gulf case before we move on? Okay.
Wait, so like on the outcomes, sorry, if you don't mind me asking, like for the outcomes, like how do we prove even if it doesn't provide like the course of justice, why is it still kind of bad, like in itself?
Yeah, propagation of stereotypes those surrounding minorities. I think this argument is probably the most accessible on the Gulf bench. So even if you don't look at anything else here, the minority argument in terms of the stereotypes and the privacy of the family arguments are quite accessible. So that should be the first things that come to mind here. And then obviously, the privacy argument is quite strong in that it is easy to argue why the extent to which public scrutiny affects the family and stuff, and why it potentially increases and worsens the trauma, and why it potentially destroys the individual's ability to ever seek gainful employment in the future. For instance, Aziz Ansari, Monica Lewinsky and stuff. It's all reasons as to why the privacy of the individual ought to outweigh public interest with regards to having access to information specifically surrounding the background of this particular person in terms of like the way of life. The stuff about
got it. Thank you.
well. Yep, tough minorities for just explain why the quality of life of the individuals are quite important, especially because they are a significantly vulnerable stakeholder in the debate, and on your side of the house, you're better able to protect them. But yeah. Okay, let's talk about the opt case. The opt case in this debate basically, the burden is just flipped. So the burden show that benefits of taking an institutional stance outweighs the harms. So you have all the harms up there. We have prepped in the gov case. The opt case, you first need to mechanize the benefits and then weigh the benefits against the harms that the gov presents. So what is the benefit of media companies taking an institutional stance on these things and then reporting and stuff? So I think I would look to this part here, that taking an institutional stance often requires media companies, the larger and more reputable one, to seek out evidence surrounding the accused, create a profile and background story, right? So this is the process of investigation and the process through which a large reputable media company needs to do in order for them to take a stance on a certain issue. It needs to be backed up with evidence and reasoning. If not, they start to lose credibility and stuff. What this means is that the media companies are likely to focus their investigation on fact-based and objective evidence, which means that the types of information they propagate to a society is likely to be good and likely to be important for people to know in order for them to make decisions, like with regards to voting or where they donate their money and stuff. Information is the currency of a democracy. More information you get, so it's better. So let's talk about that. Okay, which basically is just, I think, public information, right? Yeah. Actually, this is not just create problem. Okay, there are 4 problems here. Media reporting and taking a stance, reviews key evidence and information surrounding a criminal case of interest to national security. Okay, maybe not national security, just of public interest, I'll say that. That's a case to be made for national security, but broadly the case is about public interest. Okay, so the first thing to discuss is the process of reporting and taking a stance. Here's where you can just take the incentive analysis here. Large reputable media companies likely to prioritize their reputation and credibility, if not, if altered or at market share. Yeah, that's the profit incentive. So this implies that taking institutional stance requires media companies to support their stance with clear, objective, and fact-based evidence. Right? So, e.g., journalists with like journalistic integrity, proper research, and what's that, fact-finding missions, basically. So basically means that they are not going to jump to conclusions based on like preliminary or circumstantial evidence, like, oh, based on something some random friend said in the past, and then choose to, do that. Actually choose to make a conclusion based on that. Journalists are likely to look at a lot of evidence, a lot of case studies, using trend analysis and statistical analysis to be able to do that. Okay. using trend analysis and statistical analysis to prove reasons why they believe their stance to be correct. Okay. Here you can say that again, because of the incentive to protect their reputation and their credibility, media companies likely to use their vast resources at their disposal, hire fact checkers, hire multiple people, different perspective, let's say a statistical analysis to make their conclusions. This is things that normal individuals will not have, right? These are all resources that the average Joe will not have access to. So, why is this important? It's important for a few reasons. I think the first thing to note here is, okay, so the second thing to note is what happens in the comparative if like media companies don't do this, what often creates a lot of unhealthy discourse and stuff. Yeah, actually, let's just do that first. So the comparative is that if media companies do not take a stance on the guilt of the accused, means they will try to remain neutral. It also means that they have, number one, have no incentive to go the distance and properly research facts. But it also means even if they wanted to, they can't release info or evidence that would significantly bias public opinion in one way or another to maintain the perception of neutrality. I think the important nuance of the argument here. So what this basically means is that individuals who consume this information, who heard about these things, are likely to make their own conclusions, right? So individuals that watch the news presented with the facts of the case are likely to make their own conclusions. So if it's true that there exist stereotypes against minorities in society, not taking a stance on things necessarily makes things worse, because people are likely to have that discussion surrounding minorities in the underground way that's very difficult to regulate. Okay, existing stereotypes surrounding minorities likely to be worsened because people basically jump to conclusions in the absence of evidence, right? You can also say that the rise of basically trolls and people on social media claiming to be authorities on the matter, propagating false/bias information in bad faith to empower their own end goals. So like probably just spreading out hate speech against minorities and stuff. Far more difficult to call out and hold accountable because discussions happen in a private sphere outside the reach of greater society. So I think that's what the harm is, why it's important to have this. So what changes in the counterfactuals? This is where you want to look at the value of the information being provided. Okay, so the first thing here in terms of an outcome is large media companies reporting provides greater transparency and accountability to the public discussion. So again, we've established the comparative is the discussions happening on a public platform or happening on a private platform that's unregulated. You want to make the claim that public discussions are better. Number one, because media companies large incentive to be objective. Normal individuals, no such incentive to do that. Second, you can say is that greater accountability and ability for people to create their counterfactual. So e.g., other Black individuals sharing their own stories on social media in response to the George Floyd or like basically any other incident of the police murdering a Black person. So what this means is that it directly allows minorities to challenge the narrative and create their own counter narrative, right? To challenge existing narrative. Other than that, easier for people to call out that journalistic practices of companies, if they exist, pressure on them to be better. The second is the third thing is that there's a greater incentive to moderate the narrative, because media companies want to reach out to as people as they can across political divides. So they'll likely tone down the rhetoric used to not exclude certain groups that would otherwise likely be hurt by that. Right? And again, anonymous trolls online have no such incentive. Okay, so that's like basically why public discussions are better, because there's greater accountability to that discussion, but there's a greater moderation of the discussion and allowing minorities to stand up and challenge that particular narrative, especially when it hurts them. The last impact, the last value of reporting here is with regards to the value of that information. Okay, value of information. Why digging into the background of an accused criminal to existing structural failures of the state, right? So basically, what is this to say is that it's not enough to know whether a person committed a crime or not, but the process of assessing and coming to a conclusion about whether someone is guilty or innocent is often requires a very thorough interrogation about the motives of this particular individual and the motivations of a person. Like in the best case or the worst case where the person actually is guilty, like let's say it's a Black person accused of a crime and maybe he actually did do it. The underlying structural reasons or structural failures of the state rather that pushed this individual into a position where he had to commit crime out of desperation is of massive public interest. So people just need to know about it. And just where you can just argue why a thorough investigation into the background of the person and the motivations behind the things that it did is really, really important in terms of public accountability about the state. Okay, so here's where you can say that assessing the guilt of an accused of a very thorough interrogation of the individual motivation and incentive. Right? Such info also reviews info about the environment they live in and reasons why they might commit that crime. Okay, we can then just make the argument that environments of poverty, desperation, and the like almost always are evidence of state failure. Okay, failed welfare and economic policy, militarization of the police brutality, massive wealth gaps, right? Unfettered capitalism, etc., etc. Okay, all the classic examples you can use. So, evaluating this information and knowing about these things makes it a lot easier for you to hold the state accountable for those things and grants you the capital, the evidence, and the data points required for social movements to push for change. Right? So, having access to that info necessary for individuals and social movements to hold the state accountable for their failures. Right? So, for instance, it grants social movements the awareness and capital required for them to push for reform and legislation. I think the nuance here is that this provides very direct and visceral evidence. Direct and visceral evidence required to convince moderates might not have lived experiences to believe that the state really is bad. And like we just have this very optimistic bias as humans. We just want to believe, want to think the best of people, want to think the best of our state. And often in the absence of clear evidence, it's very difficult to believe the testimonies of minorities and victims unless they are able to see these things on a massive scale, on like a massive scale, right? So exposure to information, increase awareness of issues, make it easier for social movements to get the capital and push for change. Required for movements to reach critical mass in pushing state for accountability and change. The last thing here is that I think it's also about the nuances of policy making and stuff. So it's more like the process of change, basically, you want to focus on here. The fact that information can also be used for academic studies, NGOs and civil societies, trying to understand the root causes crime and how policy solutions with those problems, right? Require evidence, case studies, data points, etc. And all of these things can only happen with the thorough investigation on information provided by those media companies. So then the way of here just becomes why the interest of the public outweighs the interest of the individual. I think stuff about polarization and all those things in the Gov bench. On oppositions, you can say that there's a lot of ways, different ways you can try to break the echo chamber. A lot of reasons as to why media companies have incentives to reach as many people as possible. A lot of reasons as to why the tragic shooting, like the Sandy Hook school shootings, there's incentives for media companies on both sides of the aisle to cover this event in a way that is, objective, just because of all the incentives we discussed earlier, which just necessarily means that the likelihood of polarization happening is just not really there. But it's a trade-off you're willing to make because it provides the necessary information that's required as a prerequisite to achieving the very as a prerequisite to achieving the capital necessary for social movement to garner change that directly benefits minorities now, even if it might worsen stereotypes in the intermediate point in time. Right, so any questions about the op case so far? Okay, I guess not. In that case, I will end the recording here.